My name is Mike Traugott, and I'm the moderator of today's webinar sponsored by the World Association for Public Opinion Research. We are operating with Zoom in webinar mode. That means that your microphones are muted. But you are welcome and encouraged to submit questions during the course of the presentation, and I will address those to our speaker when he's finished presenting. You can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. The webinar is being recorded, and by your participation in the webinar, this is an acknowledgement and agreement that you will be recorded, at least to the extent that your questions are identified. We're very pleased to have Don Dillman with us this morning. I want Don to know that this particular webinar had the most registrants of any of the webinars that WAPOR has presented, over 300. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, as the last few people join us, you'll see that there are 222 participants currently who are signed in. Don has had a distinguished career in survey methodology. He is currently a Regents Professor in the Department of Sociology and the Deputy Director for Research and Development in the Social and Economic Sciences Research Center at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. Don is recognized worldwide as a major contributor to the development of modern mail, telephone, and internet survey methods. He is a past president of the American Association for Public Opinion Research and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and of the American Statistical Association. And Don has received the APOR Award for Exceptionally Distinguished Achievement and also the WAPOR Helen Dinnemer Award for career contributions to innovative research and methodology. Don is an author or editor of 17 books and more than 260 other publications. So it's really a treat to have Don with us this morning. And Don is going to be presenting on his latest findings from a new area of research of his, adopting push-to-web survey designs. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Don now. Thanks again for being with us.
Good morning. I've really been looking forward to this. I see the rest of you, so I think we're there. Sorry for the slight slowdown at the start here. I'm wondering what was happening. But I'm really delighted to have a chance to interact with you today and on an issue that I just find really, really fascinating. The reason for this webinar is in the last 10 years, I've had the good fortune to interact with surveyors in at least 15 different countries on 4 continents where web push data collection methods were being attempted. I've really been intrigued, most of all, with the adaptations needed in order for these methods to be worked in other countries. So what I'm going to do today is describe specific concerns, some objections that I've encountered in the use of the new methods, and I hope that the comments here will be helpful to WAPOR members and others around the world interested in the development of good web push methodologies for their country, and which I'm sure will be different in many ways than some that I have worked on in the United States. My use of the term web push, this is the definition slide. I want to describe contacting individuals or households by one mode, such as mail or telephone, to request that the respondent answer a web questionnaire. The respondent is later offered the opportunity to respond by another mode, and depending upon the survey, the country, and other things, mail, telephone, or in person, in order to improve response rates and data quality. And I want to deal with both of those. The usual goal is to reduce survey costs and produce quicker results. And so today, my focus is primarily general public household surveys because that's where most of the discussion has been. There's some reasons for the people's interest in doing this. And the interest that happens, I think we live in an era of tailored design. We use different ways of sampling and surveying populations for different population survey topics and data collection situations. I don't think that's going to change. We're past the era of trying to do most surveys in just one way, like we were using voice interviews for most of the 20th century. Those voice telephones of the general public, I think, are increasingly ineffective worldwide. Culture just does not encourage such conversations, and texting has by and large replaced voice messages along with email. I laugh sometimes because I used to go to work and I'd see all these pink messages that told me I had to return phone calls to people. And I can't remember any of those in the last 2 years that I've gotten. The world has changed. And then along came COVID-19, and it's making the conduct of in-person surveys increasingly difficult. So there are two parts to this presentation. Part one, a brief overview of efforts to develop and test the effectiveness of web push methods. And I'm going to talk about research I did between 2006 and 2014. And then part two is 12 specific challenges. I'm going to spend a lot more time on the challenges than I do on the beginning part. And I want to say about this beginning part, I suspect many of you have seen these slides before in a little different form, and I've tried to collapse them into a small unit to say, what is web push as I understand it, and what am I trying to encourage people in other countries to think about, and then what do we run into in part two as a result. So this is part one. This is a summary of what web push has meant to me in its development and the kinds of things I've tried to work with. Around 2006, there were some ironies I ran into, that there were more and more people who had postal, email, and telephone contacts, and sometimes multiple emails and multiple telephone contacts, but fewer and fewer people were willing to release to others those ways of contacting them. In some cases, one or two of them, some of them were kept private. Coverage was becoming a huge survey challenge that we just simply had to deal with. At the same time, the desire to do everything internet was growing, while the desire to do things by telephone or in person was plummeting, and it was going down because it's harder to find people at home, harder to get people to talk by phone, harder to ask for personal agency help by phone. Combining oral and visual based communications could improve survey response, but it also resulted in different answers to many different types of survey questions. Email contacts made it possible to survey thousands for nearly the same cost as a few hundred, but produced low response rates as well as coverage limitations. I sometimes refer to this as the tragedy of the survey commons. And I say that because I'm worried a lot that we tend to use up the human resource in trying to get surveys done, and that's where so many people are objecting to what we're doing. And the ease of contacting nearly everyone by phone and email and spoofing, and the spoofing in particular being untruthful about the source, resulting in trust of unknown parties going down sharply. I need to say something here about the slides and what I'm going to do from here forward. I've intentionally built in fairly long and complete phrasing in the slides that I have, because I realize English is not the first language of so many of you that are on the webinar this morning. So I've done this so one can go back, and I will probably not complete every single slide and every detail on them, but I wanted the information there so that it could be helpful to you if you wanted to go back and look at it again. This first part here is putting the pieces together in 5 US field studies. I was fortunate enough to have money that I could do study after study over the course of about 5 or 6 years, and that were fairly expensive studies. But it all started because of going to the joint statistical meetings, and I sat in on the sessions where they were talking about using residential address listings from the US Postal Service to draw national samples for in-person interviews. Not a single word was mentioned about mail or telephone, but they said, we want to get area probability samples. And I thought, holy cow, if they can do that for face-to-face interviews. Why can't I do that for mail? And all the way home on the airplane, I just kept thinking about, I've got to do something on this. The research had shown that censuses and other surveys could effectively contact households without names by mail and obtain good response. And then there were a series of field studies that my research team worked on that showed in the US responses from about half of general public households could be achieved, with most of these responses coming over the internet and rest by mail. And then if we had really big budget, we might be able to follow up by in person. So that was what was exciting and the pieces I wanted to put together. And every once in a while, it's neat to put something together in one slide. And this one slide, which has appeared in various publications, puts together what we did. The green bar is mail only that we used, and used 4 or 5 contacts depending upon the experiment. And those are the response rates we got. A mean of 53% on a general public survey of about 12 pages by mail and probably 20 to 30 minutes of response time. The lower bars is the web response and the mail follow-up response when we went that direction. And our mean here was 43% with 62% coming over the web. And when we found that we could get that many proportion coming over the web, that's when we started cheering a little bit and saying, we want to keep working on this. Otherwise, we'd have done one isolated study that I think would have been forgotten about by now. So here are the response rates for 10 tests of 12-page questionnaires conducted during this time. What I really want to talk about is what design elements contributed to the response. And I tried to summarize them all here. Token cash incentives, $2 to $5, enclosed with that web request. The problem is getting people to go from a paper envelope or a paper request, enter the URL, go to their computer, enter the URL, and enter a passcode of some kind. And that takes work. We had to get the envelope open. And I worry more about getting envelopes open than I think anybody I know, but it's a big deal. And so particularly if we're going to put cash in, multiple contacts, 4 or 5, providing an alternative response mode where we introduce the paper in the 3rd or 4th contact. And we might send a second incentive, which I think can be useful. Visual layout of the questionnaire was critical because we had to do things quite differently than we did when we were doing mostly telephone interviews. Contact of 4 to 5 connected communications, it's different details that had to be dealt with in each of them. And then we had a known legitimate sponsor within geographic region, and we had to understand what that was doing to us. So then I mentioned here the paper questionnaire because it was essential for bringing in less educated and older people. And in recent studies I've seen, that's still the case. The cover of the questionnaire had to communicate information on it. Unified mode construction. I now actually chuckle about this a little bit because when I first introduced this idea that we needed to construct the same across all modes, I had no idea that would be the most controversial idea I put into that 2000 revision of the TDM book. But it was. There were just a lot of objections to it. But I think we have to do it, especially now that we're in a smartphone age. The elements that we control are laid out down below there, where I talk about the link, the graphical design, the sponsorship, and so forth. I'll skip to the next. Why use a big brown envelope? I wanted something different that people would look at and not know what it was. I wanted people to say, this is not advertising. I have no idea why this is coming to me. Maybe I should open it and see what's inside. And so that's what we were trying to do with this kind of image at the very beginning, even though we were only asking for a web response. There's correspondence on stationery with tailored address and date. And when people say, well, it would be cheaper if we just put the letter on the front of the questionnaire. I think it's important for it to be different and that there be certain content. Addressed to the resident of the city to which sent, and you see over here, area resident, we have that in there. We have a date on there. We have $5 affixed to the letter with a sticker. You can go to Walmart and they're inexpensive. But it's important so that when they pull out the letter, they also pull out the dollars that are attached. And then the purpose of the $5, finally down here in the next to the last paragraph, we mentioned, and a small token of appreciation is a close as a way of saying thank you. This is not economic exchange. It's an expression of appreciation, and I'm trying to get that across. We, in some surveys, have tried to build local identity. I should have spelled that right, but sorry about that, identity. That is linked in the paper and web surveys. One of the things that has worried me ever since I spent time at the Census Bureau is when they were trying to develop a web questionnaire that had to be blue or some color like that, and they were trying to send it with a paper yellow questionnaire. And I said, they need to be in the same family. People need to understand that it's the same survey. And so we're going to try to do that. And I want to show you some ways that we accomplish that. But the first part is we took pictures in a community we surveyed and put them on the cover of the questionnaire on the back. And on the right, you see the back page. And I very much do not want to put questions on the back page of a questionnaire because those are usually the most sensitive questions like income or religion or something that we're ending the questionnaire with, because some people look at the back before they look at the front. And I want people to go inside. So an open-ended question here can help do that and get them back. And we thank them for completing the survey. Here's a picture of the area being surveyed. And then here's what the pages look like. But now look at this. This is the web survey. It's in the same family of construction. That is, we're using colors that are similarly. And we redid our Social and Economic Sciences Research Center webpage methods in order to be able to connect the two of them together. And this was done by Tom Allen, one of our staff here. Web survey followed unified mode construction principles. And we're trying to do that. Here's more of what we showed on the screen down here in the web survey. And this is the one I wanted to get to because it has mail on the left and what that looked like. And on the right is what the web looked like. And we wanted to get the same visual image. And the reason we need the same visual image is because there's a lot of research on visual design and layout that really shows that if we get the same visual layout on web and mail, that we can get the same kinds of answers. But if we vary the visual layout, we may affect it. But that's a whole nother story for another time. We did a number of surveys. I was convinced when we started all this that the ideas we're playing with were going to go nowhere if we didn't experiment multiple times on multiple topics so that one would not look and say, it's your topic that's giving you the response rate. This was an economic survey, and we did when we were in the 2008-2009 recession. Are you better or worse off than a year ago? A study of how households throughout Washington may have been affected by changes to the economy. And so you see the similarity to that first questionnaire I showed you. And then we go to the next one. When we started going nationwide, we picked a state with fairly low education, and Alabama is one of those states. We picked a state that was similar to Washington State in the penetration of the internet, but in a totally different part of the country, Eastern United States, and then Washington State. And we're targeting the questionnaires to each of the state with the maps on here. And then one of the things that we knew from some of our earlier work was that where you survey from makes a difference. And we just needed documentation. So we did probably our most expensive experiment of surveying about water in Nebraska and water in Washington, getting similar design on it. But we surveyed half the people were surveyed by mailing from the other state. And so we had cross state, and all these results are published in journals, and you can find them. So the key findings here that I want to bring out of this is that there was a heavy emphasis that was placed on building trust. And Gloria Arrighi's book, Reputation, is one that really impressed me in 2016 and talked about how trust was changing in society. And she's spent time in other countries, and I just found her guidance really helpful. But there are postal requests on stationery with contact information, token cash incentives, specific attention to the population, and so forth. The token cache incentive sent with the request can overcome the gap between needing to go from a URL and password in a postal request to entering that in the computer. And I'll show you a slide on that later. Follow up with alternatives to the internet are essential for bringing in less educated, lower income, older households, whether that's by mail, by telephone, or in person. But then are these results applicable to other countries? You can imagine what I'm dealing with here when somebody asks me what they need to do if they're going to do this in other countries, and particularly a country, if I've not been to it and I don't understand it well, there's a challenge, but there's a lot of things we need to talk about. And that's what the core of this talk is about this morning. And I have 12 challenges that I feel like I have run into in trying to work with others on developing web survey or web push surveys and possibilities for other countries. Just a background. I've compiled this from notes that I kept from my interactions with surveyors in about 15 different countries. And maybe a few of you on here who realize that I talked to you about this at some time or another and trying to get advice. The list emphasizes issues faced in multiple countries, the 12 things I'm going to talk about. With a few exceptions, I don't identify specific countries in this talk. I did not ask and receive permission to talk about specific countries. Also, it's good to be cautious when talking about other countries. I've spent considerable time with surveyors from other places, and I'm really hesitant to claim a full understanding of the issues faced in any of those countries. So with this little bit of caveat and explanation of what I'm doing, here's where I would go. And I would also welcome comments from any of you on these issues in your country as I continue my efforts to try to do a better job on these ideas. You'll see them in red when it's a new idea that comes up. Black will be for elaboration. I think that many people are still looking for the magic bullet, whether it's cash, pre-incentives, how much do I have to pay people in a post-incentive, envelope messages, and so forth. And I find it hard to convince people that many separate elements of survey implementation strategies are necessary and need to be thought about. But I start in what some may find as a strange place. I want to start with a theory of what motivates people to respond. And good theory can provide a useful guide for connecting survey design and implementation procedures in ways that I think will improve response rates and quality. And if you look on the left here, you see a bunch of theories listed down there: cognitive dissonance, reason action, adult-to-adult communication, gamification, influence, persuasion, leverage, saliency, benefit, cost, and social exchange. I've really appreciated the chance to interact with a lot of people on those topics. And Philip Brenner put together a book on understanding survey methodology and got theory into the title, which I appreciated. And the chapter I wrote there was towards survey response rate theories that no longer pass each other like strangers in the night. I probably spent longer in thinking about the title than I did writing the chapter, but I wanted to say that I just think these theories have passed by each other and mostly ignored one another. And most of the theories were developed for interview surveys. Many of them were pre-internet, most of them were pre-internet, and really out of date. And each theory, it's like touching the elephant. The person who's got a blindfold on, and the elephant has a lot of different parts, and you touch it and you get a very different feel for what an elephant is. And I think that's kind of what we've done on touching the theories. Most are incomplete, emphasizing certain determinants of response. Each of them tends to ignore the others. Most theories are not used to determine details of how surveys get designed and implemented. And the reality of what contributes to higher response rates have changed significantly. I want to go back to the last one I have on this slide. Most theories are not used to determine details. I'm really thinking we have to deal with comprehensive design and details rather than just focusing on one thing as the big contributor to response. When I started working on this paper, I kept trying to think about the different things I needed to do. And over here in the blue on the left, survey modes, survey sponsorship, response task, incentives, structure of requests, communication content, and respondent attributes. I find it came down to these 7 categories of things, which I think summarize categories in which we have to do something to improve response, and we've got to connect it to the things we do in the other parts. So if you want, this gives you an idea of where I was coming from and then why I feel so strongly that we have to do multiple things. Point 2 that I felt like has presented a barrier. Reluctance or difficulty of leaving behind in-person interviewing practices. And when I watch people who are getting, are trying to change, and they've spent their careers working only on telephone interviews, or the surveys have always been done by in-person interviews, that there's a carryover that often happens, which presents challenges or problems and then challenges. One of them is changing from oral to visual modes of asking questions. And I think the evidence is pretty clear in the literature that we get quite different answers to some questions if we try to ask them in different modes or in different ways in different modes. Also, the traditional interviewer persuasion efforts don't usually or don't often get considered by the people who are sponsoring the survey. They leave that up to interviewers, and the interviewers develop this wonderful art and craft of how to persuade people, how to make a judgment about what objections there are, and then being able to talk to them. And these don't usually get into publications, and so they don't become part of our tradition for designing surveys. But it's really important that those things now be integrated into words that can be communicated to people when we ask them to respond to a self-administered survey. So, and then we have to rewrite questions, so they'll work across modes. And I mentioned smartphone already as a key thing. And then we need to recognize that the principal reader of questionnaires is no longer the interviewer who sees the same question over and over and over and is trained to do that. I'm not showing a specific one here, but I've looked at the interview forms from different organizations, and they're often written almost in a code language that's become the normal way of conversing inside the organization. Sometimes when you're thinking about people on the doorstep that are answering it, they need lots of space. And so we only put a few questions on each page. That gives the person watching the interview, that is the respondent, thinking we're moving right along here fast. And we just need to think about our questionnaires in different ways. The third point I want to make, or about the challenge, is understanding how contact and response modes affect coverage and response. I think this has been one of the toughest things for surveyors to do, is to recognize that we stand our best chance of improving response and getting broader coverage in our population if we use multiple contact modes and multiple response modes. These were not major concerns until mixed mode data collection became the norm. But when I raised these with folks, the response I get was, good grief, that's a lot of stuff we need to think about. And well, then I skip to the bottom point here. I keep asking people, can you get multiple ways of contacting sample units? With some sample frames, it's not possible. But with others, you can have an address, but you can also a mailing address, and you can also get a telephone number or an email address. And that's when I see that, I think, oh boy, we've got some really exciting possibilities here in order to build communication with them. So multiple contact modes can increase the likelihood that people are reached effectively, and then offering response modes can also help us out. So this is the next challenge of where we need quite a bit of conversation. Number 4, sample frame alternatives and constraints that differ across countries. And this is where Dillman's education really got intense. The U.S. Postal Service in the United States makes a list of all residential households available. No names on it, but and postal residential addresses are available in certain other countries, but not all. Some countries in Asia and Europe maintain registration lists. Some lists identify individual people. Some of them identify household addresses and with household composition. There are special challenges for address samples. Some are available by law only to certain survey sponsors, and requests have to be submitted and approved. An obtaining list may require obtaining them individually from cities or other jurisdictions, which can be time-consuming and not to mention expensive. I smile about these sometimes because I'm thinking in my mind right now about conversations I've had and people who sent me from one person to another till I finally get to the person who really understands the list, and they just shake their head and they say, well, it's not as good as you think it is because here's what we have to go through with it. And then there's the third sub-item I have here. Of all residences in multiple unit buildings may have the same address, so pre-listing of sample addresses to identify individual households may be required. And this also happens in the US, and I helped with a survey in New York City. And this is one of the big issues we talked about, and then how to pre-list and get apartments because the addresses were the same. I also think about this in one country in Europe where they kept trying to explain to me that even the postal person doesn't know the apartment number, but they go there and then there's a list on the door. And I started walking the streets, and sure enough, every house really had a complete listing of who was in that, the unit, whether it was owned or rented on it. So there's a lot here and a lot to understand and a lot of differences across countries. Oh, and the last point here is the irregular updating, and that requires voluntary compliance. And then you talk about, well, are they going to do it or not? And then how long does it take for them to do it? So these are things that one has to get into and work with very carefully. Number 5 here is respondent selection methods that are controversial. And I just mentioned this in passing here, but it reminds me of a conversation I had with Leslie Kish when I was teaching one summer at the University of Michigan summer school. And he came around the corner from his office to mine and said, I went to buy you lunch today, but it's not going to be a free lunch. And he wanted to know how I chose people to fill out questionnaires for households. And we got to lunch and I had no idea what was going to happen. And then I said, well, I didn't want to say the quiche method didn't work for me, but I said I used the most recent birthday method. And he laughed and he said, I'm glad to hear that because the quiche method won't work. And I didn't have a follow-up conversation with him on that, but it's one thing that worries me quite a bit of getting something to be able to get respondent selection. And I know there are problems with most recent birthday. I'm impressed with some of the work that Kristen Olson and Jolene Smith have been doing, and I think with graduate students at the University of Nebraska on building question or into the questionnaire to reminder of who's eligible. And I also use questionnaire design in the cover to try to do that. And so I think this is something that there's a lot of investigation that needs to be done. And I think this is one of those conversation items one's going to have in talking about different methods. Substituting household respondents. This was another teaching moment for me. In some countries, a significant proportion of household members work and stay for lengthy periods outside the region or country. Thus, they're not available. So who should complete the questionnaire? I think when we go to self-administered and the possibility of internet, this provides additional opportunities. I really worry about in-person methods and about the substitution that goes on in many households. And where they say, well, we make 1 attempt or 2 attempts, and then we interview the other person as a substitute. There's a lot of issues here in being able to get our random samples in households. Number 7 here is changing from interviewer read to visual administered questionnaires. Questionnaires need to be shorter, especially for smartphone use where we see the cutoffs happening before they get done. We cannot add 10 minutes with impunity as often done in in-person surveys, and I worry a lot about that. Survey sponsors often object to a unified approach to writing questions. Also, there's transformation from interview to self-administration increases the likelihood that measurement will change for scale items. I used to use a lot of 0 to 10 scales, and I use them less and less now because it's frustrating to try to get them onto smartphones. And also, I guess if you read the fourth edition of the TDM book that Jolene Smith and Leah Christian and I have done, we find it went down and saying 4 or 5 points on a scale is better to think about. And we'd really like to label them fully instead of only with numbers. But these are discussions that need to happen, especially if one has used certain kinds of scales that have been long on interviews and work just fine. These changes require doing different things from staff long accustomed to their current procedures. Number 8, questionnaire construction raises multiple transformation issues. Questionnaire covers need to be persuasive, communicate who should respond and why. And you can see here, Washington Community Survey, we hope that's interesting. The subtitle, an effort to better understand how Washington communities serve the people who live in them. And then down at the bottom, to be completed by the adult, age 18 and over, in your household who has the most recent birthday. What we're trying to do here is use this as a way, because we know that this questionnaire is going to be handed to somebody and the letter may not go with it. And one person in a household may say, well, they want you to do it because your birthday's next. Then the person says, well, what am I supposed to do? And we've got to build that into our questionnaires. Why do we use mountains like this? In Washington State, there's one huge mountain. It's called Mount Rainier. And it's something people identify with. The back page, I've already mentioned this earlier. Thanks for completing the questionnaire. When you say thanks, that assumes that they've been there in the early part. If you have anything else you'd like to say, here's the place to do it. And that's so much different than having questions on the back page. We also need where the questionnaire goes back to, and we use additional pictures, which I don't do much of that anymore. Mail methods, I just want to make the point here that they've improved greatly in the 2000s. And the application of visual design concepts, the process design from envelopes to visual layout, tokenization settings, multiple communications that are synchronized, and using old methods, I think, invites failure. And this is what led me off onto the theoretical stuff that I started worrying about, because I think we just have to do better there. Objections to incentives and cash in particular. You know, I have a hunch that most of you probably expected me to get to this topic at some point in here. When I started out doing surveys, I didn't use cash. I didn't think it was appropriate to do. Over time, as I watched what was happening in society, I thought it was something that we should consider. The literature has become compelling. Token cash incentives are sent with requests to respond, have greater effects than post payments. I don't know how many more times that we've got to demonstrate that, but it's compelling. The evidence is emerging that the use of a combination of pre-incentive and post payments is better than only using pre-incentives. And there's some particularly good articles on that now. And I think that that's the direction we're heading. But opposition to cash and pre-incentives is strong. And I think it's hard to get into an hour of conversation on using web push surveys without this coming up. It will not be approved by our organization. I've heard that regularly in the United States, as well as other countries. It is illegal in my country. Others need to speak to that. It is likely to get stolen in the mail. Others are a better judge of that than I am in other countries. People won't see it in the big brown envelope. I've already discussed that a bit. We send post payments and think those work best in my country. I usually respond to say, have you done an experiment? Well, no, because we don't want to do the pre-incentive because there's too many problems. And well, we'd have to handle cash, and that is a concern on it. So there's multiple issues, and I don't want to downplay any of them, except to say these are important things to talk about. Also in the European Union, people have reminded me that 1 and 2 euros, way more than 5 euros, and postage may go up. And so that becomes the unit that one needs to think about if they're doing a pre-incentive. Yet cash incentives sent with requests is probably the most powerful influence on web response because of what happens. And I'll show that in the next slide here. We did one experiment on this, and it had controls and a bunch of other things I won't go in here to here. But when we put $5 in the envelope with a request to go to the internet, in this survey, 31% of the people respond over the internet. If we did not do it, only 13% went to the internet. That's nearly 18 percentage point difference. Then you go to the right side here and take the 31%, which is now gray, by the way, instead of blue over there. And those responded by the web. And then when we went to mail, we got an additional 15%. And the big deal was that they had very different demographics on it. The other sides here, we tried pushing to mail in one experiment, and we can push to mail. We get very few additional internet responses. Here we get over here on the push to web, we got 15%. Here we only got 3%. I want to say that if we can get people who have internet preference, we can push to mail if we want to, but it's more expensive. And we got a little higher response with a mail-only request with our $5, but the cost was an awful lot more as well. Philosophical considerations come into this a lot. We're willing to pay enormous costs of completing in-person interviews, but providing remuneration to respondents as an alternative is often deemed inappropriate. Yet we do that readily on panels. If we are basically asking respondents to interview themselves, doing the work associated with asking as well as answering questions, is it not appropriate to express our appreciation for that? I have a meeting I go to in the United States every February, and we get into this conversation in depth, and there's different perspectives within this country, and I'm sure there's different ones in other countries. Also, is sending cash to respondents legal? And that's among the considerations. Number 10, 3 more to go. Transforming interviewer behaviors into written persuasion. Is this study useful? Who is the sponsor? Why is it being done? And there are multiple places where persuasion efforts must be made. It's the envelopes, the letters, what you might like to know statements, front matter to questionnaire, and transition statements. And this is an adjustment for many people who've been used to thinking about it only with respect to the interviewer. Sponsors sometimes view this information as directives, that is, the communications, what and how to respond, rather than appeals for help that could serve a good cause. As I think many of you know, I come out of a social exchange theory background, and that's sort of fundamental to the way I think about surveys. And I've noticed in interacting with people that there's often a difference in perspective on this. Ordering questions in new ways, which I'm quite ready to do. Often people want to say, the one I most need to get an answer to is going to be first, even if the topic has nothing to do with what I told people in the letter the survey is about. For example, I remember one survey I worked on that somebody wanted the income question first, because they said that's the most important one, and if they only answer one question, then I've got income. So transforming the interviewer into written persuasion is a key issue. Using more context. I didn't start thinking about this until about the last 12, 15 years. That most common telephone connections last only 2 to 5 seconds and may not be able to contact again. And our response rates on some RDD surveys now are in single digits, around 6%. And then trying to get people to answer on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or 5th, or 6th call is getting harder and harder. And so I think we have fewer opportunities there to really persuade people. When we switch over to mail, and also web to some extent, mail allows us more contacts, or web push does. A letter requesting the web response, a follow-up reminder, a letter that looks very different because it's got a paper questionnaire in it, and then a final reminder of some kind. The content of letters more effective if different, and provide additional arguments for responding. And doing this requires quite different thinking about how to get letters open and to deliver incentives. And so my 12th point here is convincing surveyors to develop communications as a sequence of compelling and mutually supportive messages. And the tendency exists among some organizations to use the same communication content and wording in every contact. Doing that contributes to communications being ignored. I've already seen this. I even remember one experience when I was working in one agency where I wanted to use more than one contact. And the person said, well, that's easy. We'll just double print everything at the beginning. And so they were going to use exactly the same letter if the first questionnaire wasn't returned. And that misses the point that when we're trying to communicate with people, we need to keep changing and modifying, thinking about people who have not responded and other issues like this. And I made an attempt here in these next 3 slides to really talk about this. Here's a letter that is sent at the beginning. It's on letterhead. It's not a brochure. It's not on the front of the questionnaire. It tells why the household is being contacted. Now, token of appreciation. I mentioned this in the last paragraph. They can see the token of appreciation in there. And in the paragraph, I say, you'll be helping us out a great deal, and a small token of appreciation is enclosed as a way of saying thank you. I don't have to say it's for $5. I just say it's there. And I'm trying to stick within the norms of communication in a society. A simple URL and passcode that can easily be entered. This is a really, really, really big deal. I see some are using off-the-shelf software. The codes that go on to the URL are very complicated and they just don't work. Here we use SESRC at wsu.edu, and then we have things programmed on that. Consistent with how letters are sent for non-marketing purposes and provide an effective way of contacting center. And we're trying to legitimate the study because we want people, if they have questions, they need to get in contact. So we'll provide telephone number and email address. That's the first contact. The next one, and I'm just doing a synopsis here, a quick second contact. We're trying to beat the garbage cycle, if you will. I think about once a week is about all that we can expect something to stay in a household. Some don't stay that long. But if the original letters is there and it hasn't been opened, we want to get it open because the token of incentive is in there. So the reference to the previous request to encourage opening that letter, if not done, and additional information about the study, and no repetition of previous sentences. No repetition of previous sentences. One of the things I worry about so much is that when letters are get done, they're often assigned to someone lower in the organization and say, well, go write the letters. We haven't done that yet. And then they look at what other letters are said. And I think we don't think specifically about our study. So then 2 or 3 weeks later, the paper questionnaire, we can get that envelope open. It's going to be heavier. It's going to take a bigger envelope. We can say in the last few weeks, we've contacted you. Many have already responded. We hope to hear from you soon. The survey asked about a number of important issues, including the coronavirus and how people are dealing with it. We pick out one topic of interest, not saying the exact same thing we said in the earlier ones. Because of the importance, when the person with the next birthday responds, we will send them €10 as an expression of our appreciation. The enclosed paper questionnaire may be easier to complete and return. I really want to stimulate returns over the internet as well as by paper. So here I'm saying I think it's okay to offer choice on that because it's in tone of trying to be helpful. And so that's what I'm trying to convey right here. Okay, I've been through the 12 things and I'm wrapping up right now. The communications bring the design strategy together to emulate what an interviewer might do when hearing respondent questions and adding new thoughts. The envelope changes, get mailings open and read by being different. Later contacts provide a new opportunity and persuasive elements. A fourth contact, after mail, telephone messages, and later in-person contact can be used. I mentioned Statistic Canada here with their 2016 census, and these are published results. 68% came in by the internet, 20% by mail, 10% by in-person contact, and that's 98%. I mention this because there has to be cost savings that one gets on that when you can get up the bulk of the response by internet and get a significant additional portion by mail and then save your in-person contact to the very end. I think additional modes are also extremely helpful for reducing non-response error. So here in one slide is the talk. I've moved kind of quickly in going through this and I see my time. I'm just about 2-3 minutes over here, but I'll do the last 3. wanting to do far less than need or possible. And I list out these 12 items on here as things that I just talked about, which are the conversation topics that often come up in talking with people in other countries who are trying to use the web push methods. I bring back the theory on this. There's theoretical reasons for this approach and the categories of influence. And what I'm trying to do is get an emphasis on comprehensive design rather in designing only one thing on it. And so we have the survey modes, the sponsorship, the tasks, the incentives, the structure of requests, the communication content, and attributes of potential respondents. So the shift from oral interviews to web push methods using postal contact, it's challenging. I think it requires rethinking multiple elements of design and implementation. It's also necessary from the standpoint of cost and culture. It changes that we make voice telephone and visiting people's households. I want to say voice telephone and visiting households is less effective in the past, and COVID-19 put a major disruption on it. But finding alternatives to standalone in-person telephone interviews is necessary. Web push methods are not yet feasible or likely to be adopted in some countries. And I have interacted with several of those, and I really respect what people are able to do in those countries. But I expect use of these methods to continue to increase worldwide. I want to thank many of you, nobody I've named in here, but there's been a tremendous number of you who've helped me to understand the challenges associated with web push in various regions of the world. And I welcome your comments. I know we're going to have question and answer period now, and if you have additional comments afterwards on it, you're more than welcome to raise those with me. So I guess this is a place where I can stop share, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All
Don,
yours, Mike.
thanks a lot for this presentation. Absolutely jam-packed with useful information. I want to remind the people who are in the audience that you can ask a question in the Q&A part or in the chat. I noticed that some people raise their hands, but I can't see the questions to moderate them. Let me begin, Don, by asking you this question, partly about the mechanics of this. You describe these changes in questionnaire design and construction and so on. What are the implications for the staff size and the skill set in order to be able to successfully apply these new techniques?
That's a really good question, because I think it differs a lot for different organizations. And I have to digress just slightly, because one of the things that I have worried about in survey organizations is they don't typically staff with people who are really good communicators and think about how people talk with one another and how to get things into the language. They're much more likely to have the investment in people who are enforcing the rules and regulations. I remember one agency that I was interacting with that I think used 7-point type on their cover letters. And 75% of those letters was devoted to the law that allowed the survey to be done, and certain requirements. And they just kept putting on requirements and permission things in there. And I think I would probably move those out of letters and put them in someplace else on it. But it's not putting an emphasis on it. Another kind of thing is visual design and layout. It takes somebody who understands visual design and how to communicate that way, instead of communicating through interviewers. And I've been interviewed in practice sessions with a lot of large agencies, and some of those interviewers are just fantastic in what they can do. But it's a different kind of thing when all of a sudden we have to put it into written form. And that takes a different skill set. And that needs to be in an organization. And so I think about that, and I'm thinking about adding skills. In the long run, if you're talking about moving away from interviewing, I suspect you're going to cut a lot of costs and probably either be asking people to do different kinds of tasks or finding new people to take on. I kind of wandered around there a little bit, Mike, but that's something that has concerned me. And I've been frustrated sometimes that when I talk about writing communications, I finally suggest you need to get somebody outside to come in and maybe help you write letters rather than doing just the same thing over. That's not part of our statistical training as a general rule.
Somebody's asked a question. These techniques are all appropriate for general population surveys.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't persuasion different when it's an organizational or employee survey or a customer survey? Any guidance about that?
Yeah, there's differences. One is you have to think about the permission inside the organization to be able to respond to the survey on it. And that's a little different kind of legitimation process that one has to go through on it. And I almost have to, I'm starting to run my mind on various business establishment surveys that I've worked on. And one of the things that sometimes happens is that there's people who survey requests get routed to for the organization, and you have to find the people who are doing it. The work that Gary Snickers and his colleagues did on that business survey book, I've read that book thoroughly, and there's just, I think, some really good things in there about a different kind of communication that often needs to be done there than with general public. One other thing is I didn't find a place to work this in here, but I have seen some surveys that have been done of college graduates, and they've only done them on the internet. And then they also experimented with getting telephone follow-up or telephone interviews added, and then they got mail surveys added. The mail and telephone were not adding a lot of value to those surveys, and I think probably they can do those without sending out a paper questionnaire, without affecting the results very much. But that has to be thought about on an individual case basis. And one of the big worries I have about when people find they can only use the internet or email contact is the response rates are just not good when we only use email contact. And I keep trying to figure out how I can get both sets of addresses in order to, or multiple addresses, so I can have multiple contacts and get them to reinforce one another. I'm sorry, you're making me think about elaborating on something else on telephone. On the one hand, I'm just saying, I don't know how to do RDD telephone and make it work anymore. But if I have telephone numbers for a follow-up here, I think I can build on any messages that I sent before by mail or by email, and even leave a message and get an impact. I've not seen the experiments on this, but I hope some people do that and then try to add telephone later in the sequence. So I'm not saying that we should not have telephone units in our survey organizations, but I think maybe we're going to be using them differently. And I know we're using them differently than we have in the past in some places.
The presentation has stimulated people's thinking about, I guess you would call it, extensions. What about the possibility of providing a downloadable printable version of the questionnaire in the link to the web for those who would prefer to answer on paper and then send something in afterwards, or just consult the paper version? What do you think about that?
Well, I remember a presidential candidate we had once in this country who kept talking about the devil's in the details. And now I'd think about how would this be done, and what are they expecting people to do? For example, if somebody says, we want people to print off this questionnaire and send it back. That means they're going to have to get an envelope. They're going to have to put address on it. And several places that this process can fall down. And so I want to say, maybe that's not the best. There's other instances where I can see taking a set of communications and building them. And then if one can contact by email address later on, that you can say, you know, if you'd like to see what the questions are before you complete the questionnaire, here's a chance to look at them. And all you do is go over to this, follow this link, or you can print it off, or you can scan an email. We have a lot of possibilities, but I would think a lot about motivation and whether people will do what you ask them to do or encourage them to do. But we're in a world where we can think about all these different possibilities now. And I find that exciting.
You mentioned something about the importance of trust and maintaining trust.
Mhm.
Do you have any comments on using the web push approach in countries with low levels of interpersonal trust, or any tips or recommendations in those circumstances?
I'm thinking right now about the Gallup organization because it has that world survey, and when you get questions about confidence in various institutions, there's enormous differences across country. And I think United States is one of those countries now with a huge trust challenge going on. And part of what's happened is we've got this technology, and it's hard to know who's behind what's coming to us. And so it gets important to establish trust. And then another thing I think about is there are a lot of organizations that I go on their websites and I cannot figure out for the life of me how to contact them. I cannot even figure out where they're located on it. And so then I think about what I really want to do is when I'm trying to contact people in a general public survey, I want them to know who my organization is. I want them to be able to contact my organization. And I want them to be able, if they want to call me, they can call me. And just offering that they can call is one of those things, and talk to a real person is something that I think very few people will do, but I think it helps say, well, if they're letting me do this, they must exist. And then when you put these things together, an email address that they can contact, a telephone number that they can call and actually talk to a person, a website that explains what they're doing as a real organization, then I think we're getting someplace that people say, well, this is for real. And then when we explain the study to them and why it is being conducted and who it's being conducted for, that then adds to it. So I'm thinking about a whole set of things to overcome the problem of low trust and in multiple countries. Now, you specifically asked about the certain countries of the world. I remember some of those conversations and that whinge from people worried about the envelope or things going out. And what if somebody knew there was money in it and it would never get through the postal system? Also, people would talk about, well, we can use multiple contact. And they talked about somebody going out to a home and an in-person follow-up. And I remember one program officer saying that worked with several countries. And her point to me was, you have to realize how inexpensive in-person interviews are in our country compared to every place else. And then I thought, well, that becomes a more important part of the mix. And that's why, of all the things I want to say, you know, we're not into a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. And it's been very eye-opening to me to see these different challenges in different countries, but we need to respect those differences and then try to deal with them rather than saying, hey, you got to use our method, because that's not what all this discussion is about.
Some people have been stimulated to think about different or additional kind of treatment conditions. And I'm combining some questions here, but they're interested in what you would say or what you think about, for example, the difference between cash and non-cash incentives, or the difference between black and white and color in the preparation of the instruments. And also about whether you have any information about differences in participation rates by literacy levels or high and low internet penetration rates. There's a lot of things I lumped together there.
Can you put any more into that question, Mike?
Just give me a minute.
There's a lot there, but I was just writing them down. Cash versus other. The thing about cash is it can be used for anything. And whenever we get into say, we'll give them coupons, we then immediately get into how many people are likely to make use of that coupon. Is it something that's valued by them? And by and large, cash always, well, it's not by and large. I just haven't seen other offers that are more specific to some kind of material incentive ever outdo enclosure of cash, because cash can be used universally. And the second thing is, it's already there and it's in the envelope and you've received it, and it encourages a reciprocal obligation. And that's an important theoretical point. So I think of cash as the superior one, and I just haven't seen evidence that others are. On color, our colleague from New Zealand, and who's retired now, and I cannot think of his name, and I apologize for that. But he published an article in which he talked about color in surveys. I think it was in the International Journal of Public Opinion Research, if I remember correctly. But anyway, and he didn't show any advantage to it. I don't have experiments that show an advantage to using color. However, I reasoned early in this century that color is just a part of our world that is there. We're also using color on web surveys. I want to unify the web surveys with the paper surveys. And so I immediately started designing with color. Not only that, but I found that when I would use color, that I can sometimes do some things on questionnaires and with various percentage screens and other things that can really help in achieving good navigation through the questionnaire. We've got a visual design problem or challenge when we do paper, because we've got to have numbers on questions. We've got to have navigational guides. Sometimes we need column divisions on it in order to use our space efficiently and keep people going in order. I want them to answer the questions, all respondents to answer questions in the same order. And so that's some of the things that I just think are important. On literacy levels, high and low. The reason that we didn't use paper in early on is people said, well, there's a literacy problem. And so we can't get people who can't read to respond to questionnaires. And I have no quarrels with that. But the second thing here is that when we talk about the internet, there's a literacy level there on technology that is really substantial. And some people can just not handle it well. And I found it kind of funny that I was then thinking of paper as a follow-up, that to get people with less education, which is what it does. And also when there's paper, if there's somebody that's an older person and who has visual problems, somebody may help them fill out the questionnaire. But if somebody's going to help them fill out the questionnaire, we need to make them appealing. Can I throw in one more thing on that? Sometimes I've had people say to me, well, you're the guy that just wants to make pretty questionnaires. And I want to say, that's not what this is all about. It's making questionnaires that use the graphical design, the multiple languages of words, symbols, numbers, and graphics in order to help people more easily understand questionnaires. This just happens to be the week in my class where I'm teaching the fundamental visual design literacy. And it's really fun to get into that and how people are seen and how easy it is for us to confuse people with bad design. And so paper kind of falls in a different place. But there's places where people can't work. And then I think one really needs to think about the in-person follow-up. Also, telephone interviews can be helpful to us if we can identify those people. And I've seen a few surveys when there have been very targeted subpopulations that they could identify. And when they did, they used telephone to supplement what they were getting on internet and paper from others. Okay, how many of them did I answer there?
Oh, you did great. Don't worry about the list. I'm gonna move on, but I'm gonna ask you a related question that came in, which is, what are your experiences with QR codes and response rates? In a push-to-web study of a probability sample of Swedish respondents, I noticed that 25% of the participants entered the web questionnaire by scanning the QR code instead of typing the URL. Are QR codes something that you've experimented with, and did it work in a satisfactory way? This goes to the literacy question in a way, right?
Yep, it is. Well, I've had mixed experiences with QR codes. When I first tried to use them, I failed miserably because people didn't know what they were. But I've been around a long time, so I tried that early on because I was encouraged to. And I have been discouraging people from using QR codes since then until the last about, I think, 3 or 4 years. And now I think they're becoming more common. And I think about that when I go to Safeway and buy my groceries and how many people are in there and taking pictures and I see people using QR codes for a lot more things. So I think there's something that can be helpful. But let me tell you a recent experience. I'm one who just recently got COVID-19 vaccine. And when I was there, I waited my mandatory 15 minutes to see if I had a reaction, which I thought was a good thing. And the hospital I went to, on it, I saw that they had a sheet of paper there that I could fill out a questionnaire on my experience. And then somebody who was a host there mentioned that I could talk about my experience. And they said, well, all you have to do is take a picture or get the QR code. And so I got my smartphone out and I did that. And then it entered me into the survey, which is pretty neat. And then I looked around the room at the other people that were sitting there waiting, and we had to be, I think, 65 or older in order to be in there at that particular time. There's a bunch of people in there that did not have smartphones. There's some of those smartphone owners that didn't know about QR codes. There's some people there with flip phones. And then I saw some results from doing this, and about 2 million people signed up, and only about 1 million of them followed up and gave answers. And this is another topic, but I was really worried about some of the results from the survey, and if they were really trying to get a comprehensive view of what happened to all the people who had received shots, because I thought there's going to be some non-response bias on there associated partly with the smartphone problem, partly with the age, partly with Q codes. So, but we need to keep working on those because we'll use them more and more. But I'd hate to depend upon them entirely for something like that.
So I'm going to play the role of an investigator with a long-term study and a long questionnaire. And I'm looking at your presentation and thinking about what I should do. One possibility is to take my long questionnaire and divide it into smaller parts, because length is a consideration with regard to completion. But this will have a potential impact on my trend data that I've been collecting so carefully over time. What do you say about that kind of potential risk? And do you think it would be a good idea for me to take my long questionnaire, divide it into, say, 3 parts, and then send 3 questionnaires to my panelists?
Well, I'd probably want to know quite a bit more about your study and see the questions you're dealing with, and to get some sense of what you would be giving up on it. And before I even ventured an answer. But here's the more general kind of thing that I worry about. Anytime I see people dividing up the survey and they're going to put questions in different questions in different ones, then they've got a challenge on recombining those things together. And you need good staff in order to do that, and I'm not sure you're going to get the same thing. I also want to say that in the world we're in, I'm worried about deterioration that happens as we ask people to complete longer and longer questionnaires. One of the most discouraging things to me that happened is when they got used to on telephone that you couldn't get people to stay on very long. And I know one organization that limited telephone survey to 18 minutes. And then I think probably they wanted to go shorter than that on it. And as soon as they said we can go internet, it was no holds barred. Oh boy, we can ask a whole bunch more questions. And I want to say we can't do that and expect to get people to attend to them and good data. I think there are certain topics that we can probably hold people and engage them. But these days of when we asked dozens, if not hundreds, of abstract attitudinal items, and then we had to have 15 different scales included in our questionnaire, I don't think that's going to be the world we live in. And I just discourage people from doing it. Also, I deal with a lot with validated scales, and people say, well, it's a validated scale. And I say, when was the scale validated? And I'll get something like, well, about 1975. Oh, was it on in person? Was it paper, or was it telephone? I'll get an answer to that. Well, now what are you planning to do and what method you're going to use? Because method can change what you get. And then also, I almost think that we're doing a different kind of balance here, that we're trying to get such precision on measuring attitudes. And I don't think we can ever get attitudes that precise. And I just want to say, are we really getting what we need, or can we ask fewer questions? I remember once working with a person on an environmental attitude scale, and he wanted to ask a whole bunch of questions on it, and he did, and he got the scale, and he did the validation part of it. And then I saw the student who did the dissertation, and the best prediction he got on certain environmental behaviors was a question about how concerned are you about the environment? Very concerned, somewhat concerned, a little concerned, not at all concerned. And one item was doing what his scale was designed to do. So I just encourage people to think about these. Also, the other part that you got in here, it was talking about the trend data. And there comes a time when we have to bite the bullet. I remember when I was at the Census Bureau, there was one question in there about home ownership and how we rented it. And I can't remember how the question was worded, but it was so badly out. Oh, it was cash rent. And the original wording was preserved on that. But cash rent verbally means handing over cash, and very few people do that. It's now credit card or check or something else, or a bank transfer on it. And so it just didn't make sense. And it wasn't until the person retired that the questionnaire, that question could be changed. And I've seen many organizations hold on to questions for years after there's really a big concern. It's almost like an idol we put up here of say, we've got to keep everything the same. Now, I think you carefully prefaced this by talking about one of your studies, and I have no idea how long it's been going on and how critical the measurement is. But if I were going to go into a web push instead of interview, I would really be thinking hard about the changes on it. And I'd think about the mode changes, because there's some of them that the mode may be affecting your answer more than you might be, that would be acceptable.
Well, I have to.
Another good question. Keep going.
No, I have to confess, I was role playing and modifying some of the questions that were in the chat.
Okay.
I understand the value that you place on including cash in the envelope.
Mhm.
Somebody's raised a question though about alternative payments, forms of payment for the post incentive. For example, Amazon online credit, or a money order, or the choice of a check for, for people who don't have bank accounts and so on. Have you experimented with anything like that?
The answer is no, I've not experimented. But I've seen things that a number of people are doing. I've seen people use cash cards that seem like a good way of transferring money, but take some setup costs. But I want to come back to the communications here. If one is sent out a token cash incentive at the beginning, part of that is to create trust that it's a real study, then it could be important. And you got communications to support that. When one does that, and then later says, this is so important that if you're able to respond, we'll send you something later. And then a post payment in whatever form, they say, well, if they sent this at the beginning, I probably should trust that they're going to do it. That the first one acts as a foot in the door, if you will, for getting the second one done. What I worry about, I worry about a lot of things, but one of the things I worry about with incentives is post payment is people say, oh, it's just so much easier to do a coupon that they can turn in. And then they get a coupon that is relevant differentially to people. I grew up in Iowa, and it's been a long time since I've been there, but I remember when people were doing Starbucks coupons, and I thought, I'm not sure I'd use a Starbucks coupon in Iowa, because when I would go back there were not that many stores. There are more now, but in rural areas are probably not. And if I had a significant rural population, I'd be careful about that. So I think about where it is that something can be used. Now we're into this Amazon world, and things being mailed, and I don't know about the most universal companies that people get things from. So some of this may change, but that's part of life, and we may get this figured out a little better. And I would just encourage people to really do some experimentation, and rather than just saying, well, surely we can do something else, because I just don't like the idea of using cash. I have one more thing to say about cash. One of my learning experiences in life. This was in the 1990s, and there were some people from a federal agency that wanted to send out $5 to complete a long survey. And they asked me, should they send a check or cash? And I looked at it and I said, oh, good grief, send a check. I cannot imagine it getting approved to send cash. Next day, I got a call from the accounting office, and the person said, what are you telling people about using a check? They'd be on our books forever. And I said, well, I didn't know whether they could use cash. We can work out procedures for cash. And so it was a different answer than I expected. And I use that as kind of a personal example, that sometimes people say, we can't do this, because they just assume what the response is going to be from other people. And, um, and we need to work through things like that. And sometimes the answers may surprise us. We discovered at my university, where we use cash incentives for some of our surveys, that what we had to do was get a procedure in place where nothing ever happened to that cash. And so we have two people from different parts of the organization that have to work together. And, you know, if they end up with the wrong amount of money on it, they have to go back to the envelopes and get it right. Also, when return to senders come in, we've got to have the two people there to open up the return to senders. And the reason is to account for the cash. And we just have to be very methodical about it. And so once that is done, then they don't worry so much about us.
Well, we've come to the end of our allotted time for the webinar. We still have 165 participants logged in. I counted, I think at the max 255, which is just an indication of the high level of interest in this topic, Don. And I want to thank you again for agreeing to do this.
Can I just say thanks again to all the people that helped me on this, because I didn't think it was appropriate to talk about individuals or countries, but man, I've learned a lot and I still have a lot to learn on this. So thank you so much.
The webinar has been recorded and the video will be put up on the WAPOR website. Don has made his PowerPoint slides available and we can post those as well. Thanks everyone for coming. Did you want to say anything at the end, Claire?
Yes, the next webinars. The next one in April is planned to be about public opinion research in Latin America, and the one after that about mixed mode in practice.
So thank you again to everybody, and especially to Don for this very, very interesting presentation.